morning, everyone. Welcome back to the second day of our conference on redistricting and democracy in America. It's wonderful to have you all back here. We have a really exciting morning session. The first session is going to be on quantifying redistricting, which I will be moderating. And the second session is going to start at 10:45, and it's going to be how to be a redistricting watchdog. It's going to include actually visualizing some of these maps. So we talk about these maps all the time and of course throughout this conference, but we're actually going to be looking at some maps during that session. This is going to be followed by a lunch break at 11:45, and we will move back to a hybrid session. So all of the sessions will be virtual. The two sessions this morning will be virtual, but this afternoon will be a hybrid session that will be run both virtually and in person. The panel this morning is going to be on quantifying redistricting. This past redistricting cycle has marked a significant turning point in computational redistricting. In the redrawing process, new software has allowed map makers to draw increasingly precise districts, often with the intent of racial or partisan gerrymandering. However, computational tools have also provided an avenue to understand and uncover gerrymandering. The panel this morning consists of 4 professors who have been at the forefront of developing such tools. Their methods tie together ideas from statistics, mathematics, data science, and political science. This rich interdisciplinary ground has led to exciting advances in theory, algorithms, and how we view fairness. It's a pleasure to introduce Jowei Chen, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Michigan, Kosuke Imai, who's a professor of government and statistics at Harvard University, Jonathan Mattingly, a James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Mathematics and Statistical Science at Duke University, and Wesley Pegden, an associate professor of mathematics at Carnegie Mellon. Welcome to each of you, and thank you for joining.
Thanks, Greg.
So,
thanks for having me.
So I'd like to kick this session off. I think just by kind of understanding what these methods are. And Jonathan, I'm going to have you start.
All right. So, when you're evaluating a redistricting plan, one of the central issues is to have a meaningful point of comparison. Right? Something to compare it to, right? And these ensemble methods give such a basis for comparison. Although there are different flavors, they each give some relevant way to understand how this map that we have in front of us, a new map that someone's drawn, how typical it is, what properties it has that should have been expected, and what properties it have that might be surprising. And some important points are that these methods, build on the nonpartisan redistricting criteria that are laid out by the state. So they're designed to be relevant to the conversation according to the rules that have been laid out in open, in the criteria that the state has laid out. They're not built on proportional representation. They take into account the geography and where people live, so they can naturally separate packing or some type of that happens because certain groups might live in certain parts of the state and not in other parts of the state, certain political perspectives or racial groups. So it can take into account that and separate the effect of that from the effect of intentional packing or cracking or concentrating of people. So and it's all built on kind of generation of maps, but it's done drawing from some distribution that can be made explicit, and therefore the conversation can be transparent. And above all, I think what it does is it adds transparency to the conversation. That's my summary. I'm sure my colleagues have something to add that I forgot to say.
Thanks, Jonathan. Anybody want to add on to
that? Yeah, sure. So I'm happy to jump in. So I think one way I like to think about it is just, sort of like how would we have thought about districting plans before these methods? And, the way that, people would engage with the idea about whether a districting plan was somehow, unfair or somehow bad was just sort of looking at the outcomes you would get from it, right? Like, well, this is like a 10-5 map and that seems bad, or this is a what, right? We would just look at somehow the outcomes of a map, and this is still somehow, in the media, this is still often how some engagement with map drawing happens, right? When a new map is proposed, the instinct is just sort of, to think about whether the map is bad or good or is fair or not, just through the lens of, what the outcome will be. But so what these methods do is they allow you to go beyond just, what the effect of the map will be to learning something about the decisions that went into drawing it. right? Because somehow the reason we need these methods is that it's true that political geography can affect the outcomes of a set of elections in a state, even with a neutrally drawn map, right? If you just have some sort of randomly drawn districting, how the voters are distributed in the state will affect how each party does in terms of collecting seats or in how responsive the districting is to changes in the electorate or things like that. And what these methods allow you to do is not just look at the outcome of a particular districting under a particular election, but understand, when the map makers drew this map, did they throw a dart at the dartboard and hit a bullseye in terms of what they wanted? Did they get that 1 in a million map that would carve up the state in just the right way to give them the seats they wanted? Or is this a more representative map that maybe is as responsive or as balanced as a lot of other maps? In which case, you can learn that what you're seeing in the outcomes from the map is not a result of intentional gerrymandering, but just the political geography.
I think maybe the same thing in a different way is that in the past, I think when people are trying to compare the enacted map or proposed map, they often took other maps from the same state in the past or from different states at the same time. But the problem is that those, if the states are different, geography is different, border distribution is different, even if the states are the same, people move around or the rules might change. So I think the advantage of these methods is that you can hold those things constant. You're operating on the same state, same data, same rules, but be able to generate these different hypothetical maps and then make an argument like relative to these maps, this enacted map or proposed map is different in certain dimensions. So I think it's kind of a revolution in a sense, right? Because before it was always confounded by either difference in time or difference in space. And now we can actually, with this advance in methods, we can actually do this type of simulation.
Everybody here has described things really, really well. And so I commend you all for that. Every jurisdiction, including North Carolina, will state certain redistricting criteria, often traditional redistricting criteria, when they draw maps, when they draw a redistricting map. And what computer algorithms are now able to do is to figure out what would happen under a redistricting process if you actually just followed those traditional districting criteria. These are nonpartisan criteria like following county boundaries, following municipal boundaries, favoring compact districts, and obviously providing for equal populations. And so what we're able to do is to see what sort of districting maps would emerge when you just follow traditional nonpartisan districting criteria and you ignore, say, partisanship, or in certain areas, you ignore racial considerations.
Thanks a lot. You've all started to address this this idea that there was kind of this shift that happened in terms of looking at how to analyze and think about gerrymandering. We're looking at the outcome of the map versus the political geography and kind of what would happen in an alternative situation. These methods have found a lot of traction in the courts, and they've found a lot of traction in the public. And I was wondering if you could all speak to some of the challenges and some of the reasons why you believe this work has been so successful in being communicated to the public, and sort of some of the challenges of communicating this to the public. And Jowei, I'd like to start with you on that.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. It's apparent what the challenges are. It's not necessarily easy to explain to judges, to courts, to the public, to anybody outside of academia, what's going on in a computer algorithm and what exactly it's doing. But in North Carolina, here in North Carolina, 2015, 2016 were the earliest uses of these sorts of algorithms by federal courts. In Raleigh-Wake County Citizens Association versus Wake County Board of Elections, and Greensboro, the Greensboro City Council case versus Guilford County Board of Elections. These were one person, one vote cases in which plaintiffs challenged a districting plan for deviating from a one person, one vote principle, and plaintiffs made arguments about the reasons for those population deviations. And so federal courts looked at this sort of evidence in order to understand the motivations or the reasons, what explained the population deviations in these challenged districting plans. And the ability to control for traditional districting criteria, to control for certain criteria like geographic compactness, following municipal boundaries, following precinct boundaries. These allowed for the identification of the explanation behind certain redistricting outcomes, certain partisan outcomes, as well as deviations from the one person, one vote standard. So that's how it's been used.
Thanks a lot. Do any of the other panelists have things to add?
Well, I mean, I think part of your question was about how to communicate this, right? And I think that's one of the big challenges. I mean, and Joey did a nice job kind of touching on that and talking about how some of the successes he's had and others have had in communicating this court. I think when you look personally, when I look at how I talked about things like in Rucho versus by the time we got to Lewis, those are two court cases in North Carolina. I think there was a real progression and understanding. I don't know if is this a good moment to show that video I sent you, Greg, or should we wait?
We can show it.
Right. So I mean,
Right.
I think one reason to put that video up is that Joey did a great job of kind of framing that there's these criteria, these enumerating the traditional redistricting criteria, and Kosuke Louis was like, don't hit play yet, Greg. What I want to say is that I think one thing that's really important that comes out of these analyses is that we may not expect proportional representation, but what we should expect actually is maps that are responsive, right? The very fact that when people talk about a map, they say this is a 5-3 map, and somehow that doesn't matter what people think, like that it doesn't matter if this is a year where the electorate swings to the right or swings to the left, or whether the cities vote the same. I mean, there's so many things that go on in a state politically, and there's so much variation from political climate from year to year. The fact that we can just talk about a map and as if the outcome never changes, that really says something wrong about the map, I think. And that's something we've learned. We've learned that if you just look at the political criteria, redistricting, nonpartisan criteria, and then you watch what happens, you end up with maps that respond, that change when the will of the people change. So what I wanted, this video is a nice way I think that we've come up with to show this. And so if you press this button, what you'll see is in the upper left-hand corner, lower right-hand corner of this graph, you'll start seeing this Democratic vote fraction tick upward. And as it ticks upward, you'll see this blue histogram, which is what this ensemble of maps shows what the outcome would be. This is the number of seats in the North Carolina General Assembly House. And as the percentage ticks up, you see, not surprisingly, more Democrats are elected. What is surprising, though, is this map that we had prior to 2020 doesn't change at all, or changes very slowly. It lags dramatically behind this blue histogram, electing underrepresenting Democrats relative to what should have happened. And this finally, when you get to 55% Democrat, you see in this particular vote pattern, which was the vote pattern from the US Senate 2016, you see that actually almost all the maps would give the majority to the Democrats, but yet this map, this singularly chosen map, preserves the Republican majority. And you see it wasn't nearly as responsive to the changing opinions of the voters in this visualization. So I think these kind of visualizations are useful, and we're still trying to find the best way to do this. And there's a lot of interesting conversations to happen. I didn't even talk about the lower graph, but that's more technical, and that talks about cracking and packing. And we can talk about that, but maybe that's good enough for the moment, Greg. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about is I think Jonathan showed how to explain the results of the algorithm and in a way that's easy for the public or others to understand. I think it's probably not very useful to explain the algorithm itself in an intuitive way. Maybe there's a way, but I think we've been focusing on like how to communicate the results better. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is to connect, we tend to use sort of summary statistics, and that's obviously very useful in the overview of what the results look like, and people care about these statistics, and what's the sheet share, what relation to the vote share, and so on. But we might also want to sort of start thinking about how to present the algorithmic results in a particular region, a particular area, where you can sort of connect it to the actual map. You can try to explain how the algorithm are divided in a certain area in a certain way relative to the enacted or proposed plan. So I've been trying to think about, the maps are a little easier to understand. You can sort of visualize, and people care about different areas. And so to explain, not going beyond the summary statistics and thinking about presenting the actual drawing of the boundary, how the algorithm does.
Yeah, I think actually one reason it's a little bit challenging to communicate some of this is that it's not even that these methods are complicated. It already just the democratic system is kind of weird and complicated to begin with, right? This idea that, right? I mean, I think you often go into thinking about elections for something like the House of Representatives with this, tacit intuition that there should be something like proportional representation. And if you think that if there's a state's election with 10 districts and one party gets 60% of the vote, it's very hard to sort of unlearn the idea that, well, my benchmark for this map should just be how close did we get to 6 out of 10 seats for 60% of the vote. And I think we see this even in some of the discussion that happens in some of the cases. I mean, it's learning to forget that proportional representation is not what this is about is already a challenge. But yeah, I mean, once you've unlearned this, though, I mean, the question is, what is the right benchmark? And then I think there's this. Then there are a lot of ways to communicate what these algorithms achieve. But what they're doing is they're providing a way of literally looking at the alternatives that were available to the people that drew the maps, right? Like they sat down at their table with their fountain pen to carve out these boundaries, and what were the alternatives that they could have chosen. And that's exactly what these algorithms get at. And that's how they help us understand, what went into the map making process. Was this just a typical map that, satisfied the criteria that were laid out, or was this, this lucky 1 in a million map that made sure that, the supermajority of one party could survive even a wave election, right? And so understanding that the question is not about, whether the seat count matches our expectations from proportional representation, but whether the properties of the map and all the properties, its responsiveness, how durable its outcomes are with respect to changes and things like that, were really, had to be carefully optimized against the set of possibilities that were available.
Thanks a lot, Wes. So I also, before I go into the next question, I just want to remind folks, please feel free to enter your questions into the chat. We'll hand it over to your questions in a moment. I just have a few more questions for the panelists before we do that. So the next thing I want to go into is, I think it's partially clear now, sort of what these methods, in terms of, so I guess in the past decade, oftentimes these methods have been used for litigation. They shed a lot of, as you have all been sort of elucidating on, they shed a lot of light on what is happening in these maps. And I was hoping that you could just speak a little bit on, one, how do you hope that these methods are going to be employed in the upcoming redistricting cycle? And what are some of the pitfalls and what are some of the dangers that people should be watching out for in applying these methods?
Yeah, so I'll start with that. Yeah, so I think, one thing, so this is going to be the first redistricting cycle that's really taking place after there's been this huge explosion of development in this area. Full redistricting cycle, right? And And I mean, one thing that I hope to see is just for these methods to be used to shine a light on what's happening. I mean, separate from the question of, you know, exactly how different jurisdictions will respond to claims of partisan gerrymandering. Already, I mean, the hope is that, you know, these tools are tools that can be used to understand what's happening and better, right? And just, you know, when a map is proposed by a legislature, the story shouldn't be just be something like, you know, this party proposed a 5-3 map, whatever. It should be, this party proposed a map that, you know, had these properties and had to work this hard to do it because that was such an unusual thing in the space of maps available to them, right? It gives us this whole new context in which to understand the process rather than just the outcome, right? Like how much did they have to, you know, choose that rare map with just the properties that they wanted to get this map. And so, yeah, I mean, beyond exactly how, you know, claims of partisan gerrymandering are responded to legally, I just hope that the, you know, the public discussion and understanding of what's happening would be elevated by having these tools available.
Yeah, Professor Pegden put it really well, that it sheds light onto what was going on behind closed doors. It sheds light onto what specific criteria, not just on the partisan side, but what specific nonpartisan traditional districting criteria might have been sacrificed in the pursuit of a particular partisan goal. You know, and as to the main question here, Greg, the video that you know you and Jonathan put together really shows it well. It allows, you know, hopefully that sort of visualization allows the public to really see deep into the electoral consequences of one particular map versus another. You all are able to look at things in that sort of really cool visualization in under a lot of different alternative electoral conditions. And so while nobody can see into the future, you can look at a ton of different futures as you all's really great visualization looks at. And see what happens under alternative conditions.
So maybe one sentence just to say about pitfalls. I mean, I think it's a pitfall, but I would actually spin it around and say it's a strength of this conversation, right? As Jowei just said, and you know, as Professor Chen just said, he very nicely underlined the fact that you can see the effect of these nonpartisan criteria and how they play out, right? How they play out in the properties of the maps we get. But that has a flip side to it, is that, you know, it also means that when we generate these ensembles, we have to kind of be open and transparent about what criteria we're putting in and what distribution on maps we're drawing from. And, you know, if people are not using the right distribution, or people don't like the choices that someone's making in designing their distribution, that can be criticized, but that's good, because then that can be criticized in an open and transparent way. And then we can have a conversation like, you know what, you cared way too much about preserving cities relative to what we think we should be doing. That's fine. Then we can have an open, policy-driven conversation about that and then change that. And that's a win for our process, I think.
Yeah, I think that transparency thing is very important, right? These methods, while, you know, looks mathematically complicated, it is very transparent in a way that you can reproduce the results, you can change the parameters. So I think the translating between what happens in the algorithm and then what the public or different stakeholders want, and you're going back and forth iterating, I think it's really, really important. I think that's sort of the next step, not just showing whether the inactive map is an outlier.
I guess in addition to kind of these questions about the upcoming redistricting cycle, I think these methods, they've been this really nice field, nice new field in applied mathematics, and they can answer all sorts of other types of questions other than just auditing a map, of course. And so I'm wondering, what are some of the open questions or some of the things that you're excited to see these methods potentially provide light on, other than just sort of looking at the standard distribution of a state? You know, what are some of the policies or some of the open, both either scientific or policy-driven questions that you hope that can be answered with these methods. And Kosuke, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so there's maybe a couple of things I'm really excited about. One is the development of open source software. And that could serve for two purposes. One, I think it will increase the transparency. So if anyone can replicate the results by experts or some researchers, that's a good thing, I think, generally. And the second is to democratize these methods, the process itself, right? It shouldn't be just a few mathematicians or statisticians or political scientists to be able to do this type of analysis. There are a lot of redistricting cases going on from the congressional districts to the state legislature to even school districts. And so I think having a citizen, I want to call it a citizen data scientist or something like that, get involved in that process and evaluating their own communities, the plans that they care about. I think that's important. And I think the second thing that also is very exciting to me is that these type of methods can be used for different purposes. And so obviously you want to apply these to not just the very high profile congressional redistricting, but all the lower level electoral offices as well. But you can also think about from a social science perspective, like how do we model these? Like how do we model these decisions? Why some systems draw certain type of boundaries than others? Like does the commission really change the way that people draw maps? And you can also start thinking about like how do we incorporate these techniques into surveys? How do we elicit community preferences? I think there's a lot of work that's starting to happen in the field, and those are really important. And how these methods can be modified or extended to shed light on some of these important questions. So I think there's a lot of interesting applications. It feels like this is just the beginning, and we're now at the point where we can actually start making a lot of progress.
So I would say, yeah. So as a probabilist who spends a lot of most of my time just thinking about abstract theoretical questions, one thing that's really interesting to me is the interaction between the theory of sampling and these Markov chain methods and these applications where we're actually able to use these things to learn something new about a pressing question. But I'm always excited about the possibilities for how these applications give us new ideas about what new theories we should be exploring, right? So what new direction we should be studying on the theoretical side. And yeah, so I think that interaction is very interesting to me, and I think that there's still a lot to be understood in terms of not just how these particular samplers work, but the properties that they have that are common to interesting classes of sampling problems more generally. I mean, it's a funny thing when you hear it for the first time. I mean, somehow like all of these methods that we're developing, I mean, you can distill, a simple version of the question that they're addressing into a question like, here's a cookie, and I want you to like divide it randomly into two pieces. And the question is, how do you do that? What does it mean to divide the cookie randomly into two pieces? And what's the method for doing that? I mean, okay, so if I'm going to divide it randomly into two pieces with a straight cut, maybe I can do that sort of simply, although there's already some fun questions you can ask about that. But what if I really want to allow, this boundary between these two pieces of the cookie to sort of be more general than that? And what's a method that, right, I mean, I guess the thing to emphasize here is whenever we use the word randomly, we don't mean arbitrarily. We mean really randomly from some distribution. And the question of how you can divide geometric regions into smaller regions actually randomly from some specified distribution, I mean, it's a fundamentally interesting question just in the theory of it. And yeah, so the interaction between these applications and what it points us to on the theoretical side is always interesting to me.
Yeah, I'm glad that Professor Pegden mentioned that. He's done some really awesome, really cool work just on a completely different dimension, thinking about the procedure side of districting and using, basically looking at, well, what would happen if you had this kind of like one side cuts and then the other side gets to choose a districting plan or a districting cut or a districting line, based on what the first party, what the first party sets in place. And so it allows this really kind of abstract development about fundamentally rethinking or proposing alternative procedures for the districting process itself. Forget just looking at the actual partisan outcomes, the actual districting lines and adherence to traditional districting criteria. That kind of work that Professor Pegden was talking about, really fundamentally threatens to just overhaul and rethink how it is that we even think about our structural procedures, whether in the legislature or whoever who is doing redistricting, and the procedures by which the process of redistricting happens. And so it's really cool, awesome work. And so thank you for shedding some light on that.
Just to underline quickly what everyone, in a way, what people said, but just maybe with a slightly different spin. I mean, I think, what Kosuke said about kind of opening and empowering everyone, I think it's really also very interesting to empower journalists to be able to be investigatory and actually have their own opinions that they derive themselves, not just state different sides and kind of try to give equal airspace, but actually say, this jives with the truth that we've seen. I think there's, just picking up what Jowei and Wes just said also, I think there's a great opportunity for, analyzing the possibility of changing systems, multi-person districts, ranked order voting, different types, overlaying districts, different types of systems, and then actually seeing what the effect would be, and then adapt the policies to have the effect that we hope as a society we want. And the same thing can be said about, analysis of how the Voting Rights Act exists and how it should be implemented, and maybe how we should rewrite things like the Voting Rights Act, or how we should try to quantify the elusive ideas of communities of interest, and how we could operationalize them in a way that we could then use, and then what the effects might be ahead of time. So I think there's an interesting feedback loop that we're only starting now. Right now, we've been just analyzing, here's the rules that's given to us, what should we expect to see? Now it's the question, if we wanted to see something different, how should we change the rules? And I think that's a really interesting question. Thanks
a lot, Al. So we're going to turn to some audience questions now. And again, please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat or in the Q&A session. So the first one is from an anonymous attendee. So based on your previous analysis of maps, what are the main nonpartisan criteria that you see violated?
I think the main nonpartisan criteria I see violated is the fact that they're not nonpartisan. I mean, I think that's the whole point in some sense, right? If you followed the one person, one vote, I mean, first of all, there's no silver bullet. Just because you make your maps compact doesn't make the maps good. Just because you make the one person, one vote doesn't make the maps good. The point is that it's when you then choose within those criteria maps which are clearly non-responsive, that fix the election outcomes to be, 10-2, 10-3, regardless of what happens in the electorate over a reasonable, set of expected electoral environments, right? That's what I see happen most often.
Anybody else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. Oh yeah, go ahead, Wes. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So, I mean, just to echo that, I mean, certainly, I mean, whenever I analyze maps, frequently you see amusing things about, districts that were shaped especially funny, and, so, I mean, you do see people violating these nonpartisan constraints a lot. But to echo what Jonathan said, I think that the truth is that, even when you are at least like appear to be constraining yourself by making things that look reasonably nice, and don't split way too many counties. I mean, what you achieve with those kinds of crude constraints is, if the set of possible maps was the grains of sand on a beach, right? So like now with these restrictions, okay, they have to be pretty compact. They can't split too many counties. The vast majority of the grains on the sand of grains of sand on the beach now represent a reasonable map. But the last step of the process is the map makers go and they choose one grain of sand from the whole beach. And it's that very last step where I think things usually go most off the rails, right? Is that because that grain of sand can be chosen to be the most extreme, the most outlying map. Among these maps, yes, which are pretty compact with their districts and they don't split too many counties, but that grain of sand you chose is the one that ensures that, you know, whatever uniform swing of votes over the next 10 years, up to 5%, you can survive, you know, your supermajority can survive, and things like this, right? So it's in that step where where the map maker gets to choose within the set of possibilities that I think you get the biggest source of bias. And that's why these methods are so critical, because what they allow you to do is understand what the beach looks like, right? They allow you to understand, well, most grains of sand don't look like this one. This one was really a crazy one. And that's somehow, yeah, I think the critical point.
Yeah, that's an excellent explanation. I think that's exactly right. So even if you have these constraints, there's still a lot of maps that you can draw. And the question is which one that the map drawer is choosing. Another thing I wanted to add is that these constraints that appear to be non-partisan can have partisan and racial implications as well. So if if the rule says don't split the county boundaries, obviously you're trying to keep those counties intact, and that could have both partisan and racial implications. And the simulation methods are useful for understanding what those implications are, because you can simulate with those constraints and then simulate without it and then see what the differences are. So I think Jonathan mentioned this, but it also helps you to think about what kind of rules we should be using when drawing redistricting plans.
So the next question is also from an anonymous attendee. Longer term, is there a better way to get congressional proportional representation than map making?
I'm just going to chime in and say I'm going to punt on this one. So this is, I feel, I mean, this is like a big question, right? But it's somehow, yeah, I feel like it's outside this question of how to evaluate the districtings, within the system. This is about, yeah, other systems. And yeah, it's an interesting question, like what to imagine for, hypothetical alternative democratic systems. I think that there's a lot of interesting discussion there.
It's also complicated. The premise of the question is that we always want exact proportional representation, right? There's this thing called the Federalist Papers, right? This country was founded at this moment where there was a conversation between a strong central government and strong regional governments, right? And that conversation is important, right? We don't want LA and New York to decide that they want to dump all their waste in Montana because there's only 800,000 people in Montana and they don't have enough votes to stop them, right? So there's somehow, I think if you went to the other extreme, we could also have trouble. So I think that's the conversation for me, is what's the balance?
Yeah.
So in yesterday's discussion about the political landscape of redistricting, there was a lot of talk about communities of interest and the need to preserve them. How do you quantify maps? How do quantitative maps account for these communities, or do they?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I can jump in here. So that's a good question. I mean, so one of the tricky things about quantifying communities of interest is, I mean, to quantify something, we have to, mean something specific by it, right? So we have to agree on what we mean by communities of interest. But when we do agree on what a set of communities of interest are, then these methods can integrate them just as they can any other constraint, right? So it's routine to integrate things like not splitting municipalities or counties or things like that. And so if the people that drew the maps say, we drew these maps and when drawing them, we can solve this list of communities of interest, then that is something, these methods are perfectly set up then to examine the ensemble of maps available to the map maker subject to that constraint. So there's no technical problem with that. But of course, when somebody says, we drew the map accounting for X, they have to tell you what they mean by accounting for X for you to be able to examine the extent to which they did that.
Yeah, I think the measurement is a big issue, right? So you have to know what those community boundaries are. And then there's a question of who decide that, right? Like who decide this is the community of interest that we should preserve. And I think there are some, work in the field where people are trying to elicit from the citizens and maybe using the map drawing tools. And if you maybe get the sort of representative sample of the voters that collect, but everybody's going to draw a somewhat different one. So that I think it'll be an interesting question for us who develop the methods would be, okay, if you had some kind of survey data like that, like how do you incorporate that into the algorithm so that those boundaries, although every citizen might draw differently, are more likely to be preserved.
Professor Chen, you want to add anything to that?
I think everybody else stated it really well. There's going to be increased pressure on jurisdictions that consider communities of interest to be transparent about which specific communities that they're considering and what public testimony they're relying upon to understand those communities of interest. The very point of a lot of the activities of, say, the California Redistricting Commission or the Michigan Redistricting Commission right now is to take that sort of public testimony and to make our understanding of those communities of interest very public, very transparent, so that everybody can know exactly what it means if say the city of Santa Ana is a community of interest. What exactly does that mean when the commission is trying to incorporate that into their state house maps?
Yeah, I like that point about the commission a lot. There's some really interesting sort of testimony that comes up. So Sasha Pekek, and sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, has a question that assuming those in charge of redistricting, assuming those who are in charge of redistricting are redistricting with the goal of maximizing the number of seats won by their party. Is there any work in the use of your methods that identified how the changes of electoral party preferences may affect the districts? And I think this brings up to this larger question, is that you've all been talking a lot about looking at these maps, but then how to filter these maps through the votes? How does that process look? What does that process look like, and how can you understand stability of the maps and things along these lines?
Yeah, so maybe I'm reading into the question too much, but my interpretation of the question is that they're asking actually, is it possible to sort of almost read the map maker's mind and see like, oh, they expected this section to become more democratic, and that's why they did this against this background? Like, can you sort of like look at this, use our methods to understand what they were anticipating in terms of electoral changes? And so, yeah, I think it's a good question. I think definitely sometimes you can learn something about the process used to optimize the maps, right? So, for example, if a common thing to do when you're analyzing maps against an ensemble is to look at the partisanship of the maps as measured by, some historical elections, right? So like maybe you'll use like the 2010 election between these two Senate candidates to evaluate, how all these maps would perform in a hypothetical election. And so one thing that you can notice when you evaluate these maps is, okay, so let's do a thought experiment. Suppose that instead of like taking a recent election to evaluate, a potentially gerrymandered map, I took like an election from like the 1880s, okay? Just as a thought experiment, okay? What you should expect to happen then is for there to be the districting that you're evaluating shouldn't really stand out against these other districtings necessarily, because we don't think that this districting was carefully drawn to ensure some property with respect to 1880 voting patterns, right? But then as you get closer and closer to the election that was actually used, or the type of election data that's actually used to optimize the map will stand out as more and more of an outlier. So one thing you could potentially learn from these methods, which is concrete, is somehow which election data the map makers thought was the best predictor of future performance, right? And those that's the election data against which the map should really stand out as an outlier, right? Because that's the one that was really carefully crafted with respect to. So yeah, whether you can really anticipate future changes, I mean, it's not something we try to do. It's an interesting question, but I think you do sometimes have the feeling that you're, sort of, peering into the thought process of the person who drew the map. So in that respect.
Yeah, I've seen the people who put more weight on recent elections when they compute the partisan preferences across, say, 10-year period. And I guess you could take even a step further and then do some statistical modeling of, the time over change, the partisan preference, local partisan preferences over time, the change over time using census and voter files and election data, and see if that will shed light on what might happen in the future and how different plans might have different implications.
Professor Chen, this is sort of, I guess, a request to expound from Lee Mortimer directed at you. So it's asking for you to comment on the statement that you made in your New York Times article, "Don't Blame the Maps," which says Democrats' geography problem is bigger than their gerrymandering problem. Unless they are prepared to take more radical steps that would require a party's seat share to approximate its vote share, reformers in many states may not get the results they're expecting. And so I think, oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the other panelists on here, are all also really, really qualified and really expert in this, and so I'd love to hear their thoughts on this. So, it's kind of hard to remember sometimes, but we're in North Carolina, and all the redistricting battles, all of the lawsuits have been challenging plans that were drawn by the North Carolina General Assembly, which has been a Republican-controlled legislature. But these same battles play out in other states, and some of those other states are legislatures that are controlled by Democrats. Democrats can engage in partisan gerrymandering as well, and in fact they do. And so nationally, there is some extent to which, if you look at seats in the US House, to some extent, this actually cancels each other out. Some US House districts are drawn by Democrats and others are drawn by Republicans. And so there is an extent to which nationally, partisan gerrymandering does cancel each other out. The geography issue is something that I think some of the other panelists here are very qualified to talk about, and so I'd love to hear their thoughts about. But obviously, like in North Carolina, as in other states, Democrats are concentrated in urban areas, and that does, of course, that's part of the political geography that shapes the distribution of. Anytime you produce maps that are just following county boundaries, following municipal boundaries, just following geographic compactness, there is going to be a partisan effect. And like in many other states, there is an extent to which that effect does favor Republicans.
And I think I want to make the statement that, when I say a map is biased, I don't mean that it's biased relative to proportional representation. Just our system has a design in it that geographically spread out political parties get more representation, because we kind of give a vote to the people and a vote to the land, because we have our districts spread out. And so, but that doesn't mean you can't separate the two. That doesn't mean you have to throw up your hands and walk home, right? When we did an analysis of Wisconsin, we saw very clearly that there was definitely that one party needed much less than 50% often to win 50% of the seats. But the maps that were being used gave them 50% of the seats at even much less than we should have expected statewide fraction. So I think I think that that's, so it's just, I think it's more about the expectations of some reformers. They think that if this done, then we're going to snap to proportional representation. And I don't think that that's true.
So Professor Imai mentioned a possible study in which somebody could look at splitting counties versus not splitting counties and kind of see what the difference is between those things. To what extent have you seen policy been able to drive partisanship? And this is a question, paraphrased question from Austin Buchanan.
Wait, what was the last part? What was the last sentence you said? Sorry.
This wasn't necessarily directed at you. It was just inspired by one of your comments.
Oh, okay. I didn't catch your last.
Yeah, no worries. The question was, to what extent have you seen policy decisions affect partisanship in maps?
Oh, I see. Yeah, I don't. Probably others can shed light more on this, but I've seen differently what Jowei described, which is Democratic voters or African American voters, for example, and depending on the area, are concentrated in the city. So unless you create a district that stretch out into the suburb and captures some of the white voters or the Republican voters, the Democrats going to be packed in, or African Americans will be packed in a small number of districts. So that is clearly like if there is a county boundary that prevent you from doing that, that's going to have a huge impact. The similar thing is like also happens in the school districts, like in some of the cases I've seen, where if you mandate, the students have to live very close to the school, then you end up creating a district where it's concentrated, like, poor neighborhood, everybody's going to the same school, as opposed to, some other schools. So if you change that distance threshold, that could mix different types of students at the same school. So I think these decisions actually really matter. And I'm repeating myself, but the simulation methods really, I think, able to shed light on this because we can change the rules and then see how different boundaries can be drawn.
So Stephen Schechter asks, do these methods shed light on whether citizen commissions produce more typical maps than do legislatures?
I think that's a great question. I think that, I don't know if anyone has a consensus opinion yet, but I think that's something we'll definitely be hearing about in the next decade. People will certainly be studying that question, given that now with the diversity of different commissions we have. I don't know, Wes, Kosuke, Jowei, anyone have a thought already?
I think a good example is your analysis of the judges map. I mean, it's not the same, but it's just like, right? I mean, if you want to, I don't remember exactly.
So some number of years ago, a previous Duke conference, beyond gerrymandering conference, one of the center points of that was a bipartisan redistricting commission simulated one that was a bunch of retired North Carolina justices of both parties, and they do a map, and that map was a very good map, and that was a very political process. I sat in the room and listened to them quietly in the corner. Greg did too, and we heard them horse trade and argue about incumbency and all different things. But yet the map they made in the end was somehow very responsive. It when political opinions changed, that map produced different outcomes. So I would say, yeah, I think that works. I don't know what's going to happen in the Michigan we've done some analysis of Arizona, but we're not really we don't have consensus yet.
Yeah, I think that humans, so this is maybe a little bit provocative, but humans have certain limitations, right? So you can probably draw a map that is pretty good with respect to one or two dimensions. But as soon as you start adding lots of constraints and lots of criteria, I just think the humans have inherently limitation, in terms of doing well on all those criteria and just somehow figuring out. So I almost prefer to have some like algorithm assisted drawing process where obviously humans are involved. You probably don't want to just outsource it entirely to the machines, but you can get some help the insights from algorithm and then sort of think about, okay, what are the issues? How should we form a district? So like my sort of ideal world, like people will use these algorithms to, help themselves understand what are the trade-offs and come up with the type of maps that are maybe much better than one could have done if they just try to do it themselves by hand.
In North Carolina, we've had, it's not just the judges drawing that congressional map. There was, for example, like Campbell law students kind of having their own kind of line drawing process, producing their own maps. And so that it sheds really good insight into what happens when you have ordinary citizens or judges, non-interested, people who are not interested politicians with a self-interest, drawing districting lines. And I'm really gratified that you all looked at that last decade. Greg and Jonathan, what did you all see in the room as far as what the process was like when the judges were trying to balance their understanding of the various nonpartisan criteria? How did you see that process play out? And you all obviously thought they did a pretty good job. What is it that they really did well that maybe the General Assembly could learn from?
Jonathan, you want to take that?
It's a provocative question. It's been a while, right? That was 2016 or 17 or something like that. I will say that they were not singularly non-political, right? They definitely traded jurisdictions, but I think they didn't have this surgical precision. They didn't use they honestly, truly didn't use any partisan data, right? They weren't looking at distribution of voters, right? And then they let everyone in the room be okay with the map. It was a consensus process, right? So there had to be horse trading and decisions made, and at the end, it wasn't just that some group said, well, we have more people on the commission, we're going to make the decision. They said, okay, is everyone okay? And then they voted which map to pick, but I think it was as much a consensus building process. And so I think that was important to it, right? And the fact that they really, truly didn't have any partisan information that they were using, looking at the maps, other than at the very end, somebody after the fact checked to make sure the Voting Rights Act was satisfied. And then other than that, there was nothing that was even close to being construed as partisan, other than their just ground knowledge of the state, which they had copious amounts of. And in the end, we got a map that was much more responsive than any of the maps we saw from the other political processes.
And there's a follow-up question from, or it's not built as a follow-up question, but I think it follows nicely from an anonymous attendee, which says, if instead of this bipartisan judges who were horse trading with each other, as you said, if map makers, any map makers, didn't have party information, would that help, or can that be derived from other information they have?
I think if they truly don't have, you cannot have partisan information on the desk in front of you, and somebody can walk in and hand you a map, right? That they made in the room next door with their partisan information. I think that amounts to partisan information, right? So I think it depends on whether they really don't use partisan information. I think they all know things, but I think it's that precision that you need to often do these kind of things. I think that's something that comes out of West's analysis, for instance, how fragile these highly gerrymandered maps are.
Yeah,
any legislator knows his or her district really well. Maybe there's nobody in North Carolina that knows every last precinct in North Carolina well, but anybody who gets elected to office at any level, your constituents really well, and every neighborhood in your district, and who's a Republican and a Democrat. That's part of the process of running a campaign and getting elected.
Yeah, I would say that because there's so many ways for partisanship to sort of sneak into the process, partisan data rather, just sneak into the process, either, explicitly with the map on the table, or implicitly just through people that know their districts really well. My sense is that better than trying to, sort of ban the use of partisan data is to make sure that partisan data is used when evaluating the process itself. Like, did this, is this map that was produced, a crazy outlier against what could have been done? And so, for example, I guess this question comes up sometimes with the independent commissions, right? Should independent commissions have access to partisan data? And one case that you can make that they should is that without doing that, the process could somehow be, perturbed to have a partisan outcome, through some sort of, backdoor introduction of partisan data like this. And with most people on the commission not even being aware was happening, because without using partisan data, you're blind to whether you've done this thing. And so I think that there's a case to be made that the most important thing about partisan data and redistricting is to use it when you're looking at what was done.
I think that's the advantage of the algorithm, right? So the algorithm can forget about all the information about partisan data. People may not, and it's hard to verify.
So switching back from process to policy-driven questions, Billy Correher asks, do more compact maps tend to favor Republicans? Since Democrats are concentrated, do compactness mandates mean they're more likely to be packed?
I think it depends a lot on the scale that you look at it. There's a real question of how big the districts are. I think Joey's done some thinking about that with Jonathan Roden. But I think necessarily if people are very compactly located, then compactness will favor the other party because they'll have more control over the more spread out areas. But I think it depends a lot on I think it's why we don't have exact proportional representation, is that we want compact districts, right? Yeah. But whether that's a problem or a feature is a part of the conversation.
Yeah, Professor Imai was talking earlier about how he's noticed concentration across, I think across the country of Democrats of racial minorities, and so yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that, Kosuke.
Yeah, I think it's not so much. Well, I guess it is compactness. I guess it also depends on how you define it, and a lot of it is depends on like geography. But I have seen, for example, in the South, like Alabama or some other areas where racial minorities who tend to be Democratic overwhelmingly are concentrated in the city. And even if you look at the state legislative districts, if you really impose those compactness or no county boundary split type of constraint, it just end up packing those voters because of the way that they are distributed spatially.
Yeah, and as sort of mathematically, it can be interesting to think about the extreme. Like, what if we completely threw out compactness altogether? Or like, to start with, let's say we also threw out the requirement that the districts had to be connected, right? And then like a district would just be like a peppering of little like regions of the state all around, right? And each district would just be this peppering, right? And what would happen then is that each district would really behave like a random sample of the voters of the state. And if one of the parties got 55% of the vote in the state, they would basically get 55% of the vote in every district. And so they would win every seat, right? And so in this extreme case where like we just throw out all criteria, it's essentially like having at-large seats where, whichever party has a majority of the state would just get every one of these in essentially one election. If you just want to think about throwing out compactly, so you could keep like this connectivity requirement and throw out just compactness, but still if you like allow yourself to draw the maps at a very fine scale, like what you should expect to get here, I guess, I don't have a picture of this, but you should expect to like basically get like these fractal districts. They'll just look like these weird, like spiny, like fractals all throughout the state, which will still behave basically the same way. Like they'll behave like random samples of the state. And so you would get this effect where like 55% of the vote wins you every seat. So yeah, somehow like imposing these constraints is the only reason why why we're not like that. And so, this kind of gets back to this whole point that somehow, I think one of the reasons why it can be hard to explain this stuff is that the system itself is kind of weird. Like the way maps behave is just already weird. And, you know, the fact that you can have this behavior in elections, it's a little bit counterintuitive. And so, yeah, learning sort of what the baseline expectation is yeah, it's a process.
So Sasa Pekek follows up with related, what is the panelists' probability estimate that the election in 2022 will bring back the national level anomaly of the 2012 House elections when the Democrats won the national votes, but the Republicans got the majority?
I guess I'd like to ask him why he says it's an anomaly. I mean, based on what Wes just said, right? I mean, Wes just explained that, you know, geographic districts don't give you proportional representation. So why are we still always asking questions about proportional representation?
And I'll just freely admit I won't answer the question. I won't pretend to. So.
I think this is a really nice question. It's from an anonymous attendee, and it asks: what are the policy decisions based on what you've seen so far, or do you need more information? But what are the policy decisions that you think should be made to make maps more fair in the future?
I mean, we're kind of at this stage where, like, I think, and I hope that things are changing so rapidly, but I kind of feel like, I think the things that we say now will feel maybe naive in 20 or 30 years. But right now, I think we're at this stage where the main thing is just to, get this idea that we need to look at the maps and understand, was this just a carefully drawn outlier to achieve a partisan goal, and have a perspective on that as a society, which is honestly something that we didn't do before, right? This is a new thing because we couldn't do this at all before. We could say, I don't like this number of seats, but we couldn't say, from the possibilities available to the map maker when they drew this map this time, was this a crazy thing, and should we care about that as a society? And so, I mean, it's sort of in its infancy, but just making that part of how we think about and respond to this is I guess where we're at now. But yeah, I hope that 20 years from now we'll say, well, there's all sorts of things that I could have said here instead that would have been very prescient.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's the technology and the citizen participation. So now that we have and it's still maybe at the beginning, there's going to be more methods coming. Advances going to be coming in the future, but now we have these methods that can really shed light on some of these issues that we've struggled with for a long time, and data open, maybe open source software packages available, so people can really participate in a variety of ways. And Jonathan mentioned the journalists can also analyze, and so all of that makes the process much more democratic and fair. And usually if you have a democratic and fair processes, it leads to the outcome that's more fair. And so that's sort of my hope, is sort of the power of technology, combined with the citizen participation, can really make a difference.
We've been talking about these other states like California and Michigan, and there are also other jurisdictions that have been experimenting with independent citizens redistricting commissions and seeing what kind of plans they produce. And their process, a lot of their policies are different than what legislatures have traditionally done. Obviously, citizen engagement, having public hearings, is one hallmark of that process. But so is openness and transparency, and making all of their documents, all of their considerations, having all of their meetings live streamed. That's all part of the hallmark of what we're seeing these days from these various citizens independent commissions that are popping up in different jurisdictions.
I think it's a really interesting question to see, like, how could we change the rules of the game to make it more responsive and more transparent. And I think I'm definitely against having a redistricting computer that just draws the map and spits out. I think that sounds like a bad Doctor Who episode and not a future that I want. But on the other hand, it was actually interesting to watch what happened last time in North Carolina when the legislature started from one of Jowei's randomly created maps, and then hacked it. At least in one of the chambers, they did this much better than in the other. But I like the idea that then every single change you make, you have to make an explicit amendment or explicit motion to change it and explain why you're making that change. I think that would already do something interesting, right? I also think the not citizens redistricting process is a great idea, and not nonpartisan redistricting, entities making maps. But if we're working within the framework of our legislature, it's this interesting sub question how to make that. I think above all, sunlight is the best thing. The more honestly transparent and the more honestly forthwith everyone has to be about why they're doing the things they are. If you think it's important to protect incumbency, fine, then let's talk about it. But let's do each thing in an open and forthwith way. Anyway, I think we're winding up.
And I think that was actually a wonderful question to close on. So thanks to all of the panelists for their insightful answers. Thanks to all the great questions. I know, unfortunately, we didn't get to all of them. I think everybody has emails. So we have about 1 minute until we start the next session with Melissa Button, who's going to be moderating the session, who's the Senior Communications Specialist at Duke Law School. And Tyler Dukes, who's an investigative reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer, and Blake Esselstein will also be there. I'm very excited for the panel. So I'll be in the background, but I'll be participating in the next panel. So thanks to everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks to everyone for coming. That's one of the organizers.